The drinking and worshipping of wines goes back longer than written history. It emerges with civilization itself from the east. It was in fact the Romans who brought first vines to France at about 500 BC and planted them in Bordeaux at approximately 50 AD. There has been much speculation about the quality of Roman wine, which is quite well documented. It apparently had extraordinary powers of keeping, which in itself suggests that even then it was good. The great vintages were discussed and even drunk for longer than seems possible. There are records of a wine made in 121 BC being drunk when it was 125 years old. The most consequential move in history was when the Romans took their vines to Gaul. By the time they withdrew in the 5th century from what is now France, they had laid the foundations for almost all the greatest vineyards of the modern world. Unlike the Greeks, the Romans were not limited to earthenware and amphoras to store their wines in. They had barrels not dissimilar to modern barrels and bottles not dissimilar to modern bottles. Shakespeare was also a great lover of wine and left some of the most descriptive tasting notes of the 17th century. Late in the 17th century, the cork was discovered. Bit by bit, it became clear that wine kept in a tightly corked bottle lasted much longer than wine kept in a barrel as it had been, which was likely to go off at any time after the barrel was broached. It was also discovered that wines kept in different sized bottles also aged in a different way, acquiring what is known as a bouquet. The wine trade was booming, and Bordeaux wines were being exported all over the world. In fact, ships were measured by the number of tons of wine they could carry. In 1855, Napoleon III effectively started the Fine Wine Index when he classified the wines in Bordeaux from 1 to 5. He based his decisions on the quality and prices realized of each chateau wines over the previous 100 years or so. Apart from one change in 1979, when Chateau Mouton Rothschild was promoted from a second growth to a first growth wine, nothing has ever changed. In fact, the laws he put in place in 1855 are vigorously upheld today and controlled by the Institut des Appellations d'Origine and upheld by EU directives. In Bordeaux alone, there are more than 4,000 different chateaux producing good quality wines, but when it comes to investment, there are fewer than 100 fine and rare wines that are worth investing in. When choosing a wine for investment, the first thing to address is whether the wine comes from a recognized classification. If it comes from a recognized class, then it will be tied into producing wines in its class under strict rules and directives upheld by the European Union. The main key point about a classified wine that makes it a good investment is the restriction on the number of labels they can print for each vintage. It is the limited quantity produced that creates euphoria around each vintage, as it is always in short supply. This creates demand worldwide, and as that wine is drank over time, its quantity eventually gets to zero. Along the way, the price increases because of this simple supply and demand scenario that happens every year with every vintage of the most special wines. There are many great wines being produced in New World countries like Australia, USA and New Zealand, but they are not part of classifications. They can produce as many bottles as they wish on each vintage. Some of the best wineries in the USA and Australia do have limited production, but it is not under legal obligations. Instead, it forms part of their marketing. These are the classifications that are on our website. Just visit the Best Wines for Investment on invesntowine.com. We will focus on the 1855 classification for this training because it's the most popular. There are only 5 wines in the first growth classification listed in the 1855 1855 classification of Bordeaux, which was created by Napoleon III. Chateau Lafite Rothschild, Chateau Margaux, Chateau Haut-Brion, Chateau Latour, and Chateau Mouton Rothschild. So you see, it's not difficult to analyse 5 wines and 5 new vintages per year. You could happily just buy these 5 wines on a consistent basis and still do quite well as an investor. I'll show you all the top classified wines produced in France on our website. Having a list already prepared that you can refer back to at any time should make life as a wine investor much easier for you. I still refer back to it on a regular basis, since there are so many wines to remember. Depending on your budget, you should really try to buy those wines that are listed at the top of their classifications. For example, I just mentioned first growth wines because they are the first wines in their class, and the higher the wine is in its classification, the more strict the rules of production are. It is quite interesting to note that the way these wines are produced within their strict rules maintains a certain element of quality and longevity in these wines. There are good bottles of wines over 100 years old that are enjoyed regularly. This is how you find the best wines for investment. You go to our website, click on Invest into Wine, click on the blog, and go to track record. Underneath it's got best wines for investment, and you can see the list of wines here. One of the oldest chateau in the 1855 classification is Chateau Haut-Brion. There are records of winemaking dating back to 1423. These wines will easily outlive you, so you can leave behind a legacy for your children or grandchildren. First and second growth wines are considered low risk because they are more popular. Most people have heard of Chateau Lafite Rothschild or the Rothschild family. It's easier for somebody who wants to impress with an expensive bottle of wine to buy something that he or she has heard of. These are better known names have a ready pool of buyers also when you need to sell for profit. The lower down the classification ladder, the less popular a wine might be. They fetch a lower price and they tend not to increase in value as aggressively as the first growth wines in their class. There was a boom in Lafite Rothschild several years ago, mainly due to the upcoming Chinese. The billionaires were giving gifts in China to government officials. Some said it was popular because it was a word that was easy to say for Chinese native speakers, and because Lafite was already one of the most well-known wines in the world. Its popularity was propelled throughout China. It's always easy to buy something that we can relate to. Wine is customary across the globe. If you want to impress somebody or you want to give a generous gift, a bottle of wine will generally fit in nicely. Since wine comes in all shapes, sizes and price tags, it's an easy gift to choose for someone. And since Lafite fetched a higher price than most wines, it was an easy target for gift giving in China. For those government officials that needed impressing, the word soon got around in China how much a bottle of Lafite cost. It was one of the most expensive and therefore it was positioned as one of the best. It's extremely auspicious and generous in China to hand over a bottle of 1982 Lafite Rothschild, which fetches around $5,000 a bottle today. The old laws of supply and demand always give these top-class wines the edge when it comes to traditional investing. Their performance is considered very consistent, and you should try to be achieving anywhere from 5 to 15% per year on any given vintage. Some of the wines I recommend can grow more than 20 to 30% in 1 year. It just depends on how negotiable the market is at the time. It also depends on the age of the wine. We often invest into these wines when they're young, from the moment they're sold by the chateau whilst they're still in the barrel, right up to around 10 or more years. The young vintages such as En Primeur, which will give you a more aggressive return. En Primeur is the period when a wine is still in the barrel that has not yet been bottled. Returns can be as high as 30% in 1 year. However, if the critics taste the wines later on and find the wine is not performing well after it's bottled, then they can actually downgrade the rating, which can affect the price. Therefore, they would carry more risk to a higher reward than obviously the older vintages. And older vintages, say something that is 3 years or older, will be more stable in growth. It's already tasted and it's known for its style. This is usually the easiest period to make growth without taking too much risk. A vintage that is 8 to 15 years old will give you the most stable return, but it will also likely be the lowest. Expect around 4 to 7% a year from an older vintage. It's good to have a range of vintages in your portfolio because it gives you diversity to balance out your portfolio. If you're actually younger, you may have an appetite for more risk and you may want to be more heavily weighted in new vintages. If you're above 50 or 60 years of age, then you need to maintain a balance of vintages to ensure that you're not taking too much risk. A balanced portfolio of wines will actually give you a good, steady growth over a period of time, which should perform better than inflation and most traditional stock market products that are offered to investors. You can see that there are lots of different classifications. So like I mentioned initially, let's just focus on the first growth for this training, looking at these wines. And there is the Sauternes and Barsac from Bordeaux. There's the Saint-Emilion classification from Bordeaux. And these are the Premier Cru. So these are actually Grand Cru class. So what I've listed up here is just showing you the first growth category of that particular classification. So this is another classification, and again these are the first growths. And again this is the Saint-Emilion classification, a different classification again from a region, Saint-Emilion, and again Premier Cru, Grand Cru Class A. We have the second growth Bordeaux, we have the full 1855 classification, we have Burgundy wine classifications, we have Sauternes and Barsac from Bordeaux, we have Saint-Emilion, the full classification. We also show the top 100 champagne classifications. So have a look through those. You're welcome to go and study them and look at them. You're welcome to ask me any questions you like about them. I do sometimes buy the different classifications. It really depends on the deals that I can find at the time. But as I said, as you're building up a portfolio as a private investor, I would really just look at the 1855 classification, or even just the first growths within the 1855, the Sauternes and Barsac and the Saint-Emilion. Again, depends on your budget. So maybe these wines are too expensive for your budget, in which case you may go to the 1855 classification of Bordeaux and look at a second growth classification, which are predominantly ranging between 1 and 2 to 3,000 US dollars per case. You can get them as you can get young vintages around $1,000 a case. So it is possible, but again, don't expect great results. The best returns usually come from the higher growth wines, the first growths. Although, as it has been known, after first growths grow rapidly, we do sometimes see the second growth market grow following the first growths. So lots of good, stable returns from pretty much the first and second growth classifications. I don't invest in anything above second growth, so I don't go for third growth, other than maybe Chateau Parma, just like 1 or 2 wines that are really popular in the market and they get a good following and they do have good returns. So again, this classification goes from 4th and 5th growth in that. That's just one classification. So as I said, all the classifications are listed on our website. You're welcome to study them. But I always agree. I always think it's better to keep it simple. Understand the market, get a feel for it, and then if you really want to tackle the other types of classifications, then that's no problem.